On the bitterly cold evening of January 30th, 1933, a dense winter fog hangs over Berlin. The streets glisten beneath gas lamps, their pale light reflecting from damp cobblestones as thousands of people drift towards the imposing Reich Chancellery. Some have traveled for hours simply to witness history. Others stand in uneasy silence, uncertain whether they are watching the beginning of national renewal or the end of something they cannot yet define. Uniformed policemen struggle to keep narrow passageways clear, while members of the Sturmabteilung, better known as the SA, mingle confidently among the crowds. Their brown uniforms have become an increasingly familiar sight across Germany, symbols of a political movement that has grown from the fringes into the center of national life. Inside the Chancellery, conversations are measured and restrained. Government officials move between offices carrying papers whose significance few fully appreciate. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging First World War field marshal, whose authority still commands enormous respect, has agreed to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The decision follows months of political bargaining, collapsing governments, and mounting pressure from influential conservatives who believe they can harness Hitler's popularity while keeping him firmly under control. Outside, however, almost no one knows the precise calculations unfolding behind those heavy doors. As darkness settles across the capital, torchlight begins to pierce the mist. Columns of SA and SS men assemble with military precision before marching through Berlin's broad avenues. Brass bands echo between government buildings. Boots strike the frozen streets in perfect rhythm. The flickering flames cast moving shadows across the faces of spectators, many cheering enthusiastically, while others watch in anxious silence. According to contemporary reports, tens of thousands witness the procession, although exact figures vary between sources. News photographers capture scenes that will soon appear in newspapers across Europe, presenting an image of discipline, confidence, and national purpose. For many observers, it appears as though Germany has simply welcomed another chancellor. Since the collapse of stable parliamentary government, several men have occupied the office in rapid succession. Yet beneath the ceremony lies something profoundly different. The movement now entering government has spent years refining methods, unlike those employed by its political rivals. It has mastered mass communication, exploited public fear, embraced carefully organized violence, and learned to operate both within and beyond Germany's democratic institutions. Its leaders understand that power is rarely seized through force alone. Often, it is accumulated patiently, piece by piece, until resistance becomes fragmented and uncertainty overwhelms opposition. The extraordinary reality is that Adolf Hitler has not conquered Germany through a conventional military campaign. There has been no invading army, no civil war fought across every province, no dramatic storming of government ministries. Instead, his rise has depended upon a sophisticated strategy that combines legality with intimidation, propaganda with political negotiation, and spectacle with relentless organization. It is a strategy developed over years of failure, adaptation, and opportunity. Few standing beneath Berlin's winter sky can yet imagine how completely it will reshape their nation, or how its consequences will spread far beyond Germany's borders. To understand how this moment became possible, it is necessary to step back from the torchlit celebrations and return to the shattered landscape left by the First World War. Germany emerges from the conflict exhausted beyond measure. More than 2 million German soldiers have died during 4 years of fighting, while millions more return carrying physical wounds or invisible psychological scars. The imperial government collapses in November 1918 as military defeat becomes unavoidable. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates and departs into exile in the Netherlands, ending centuries of imperial rule. The republic established in his place inherits immense burdens. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposes territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations that many Germans regard as deeply humiliating. Historians continue to debate the precise economic effects of the treaty itself, yet there is broad agreement that its political consequences are profound. Large sections of German society come to associate the new democratic government with national defeat rather than national recovery. Political extremists on both the left and the right exploit this resentment from the Republic's earliest days. Violence soon becomes an unsettling feature of everyday politics. Communist uprisings erupt in several cities. Right-wing paramilitary organizations respond with equal brutality. Assassinations claim prominent political figures. Governments rise and fall with alarming speed, while fragile coalitions struggle to command lasting parliamentary support. Democracy survives but often appears weak, divided, and incapable of restoring stability. Economic crises deepen these political fractures. In 1923, Germany experiences one of history's most devastating episodes of hyperinflation. As the government prints vast quantities of money to meet financial obligations and support passive resistance during the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr, the value of the German mark collapses at astonishing speed. Prices change within hours rather than days. Workers rush from factories to spend their wages before they lose further value. According to surviving records, some families transport banknotes in baskets or wheelbarrows because the paper itself becomes almost worthless. Savings accumulated over decades disappear in a matter of weeks. Although currency reform eventually restores stability and the middle years of the 1920s bring a period of relative recovery, confidence remains fragile. Much of Germany's economic improvement depends heavily upon foreign loans, particularly from the United States. Factories reopen, cultural life flourishes in major cities, and unemployment falls for a time, yet underlying weaknesses remain unresolved. Political extremists continue building disciplined organizations even while democratic parties celebrate temporary calm. Then comes the Wall Street crash of October 1929. Financial shockwaves travel rapidly across the Atlantic. American lenders recall loans. German banks come under severe pressure. Businesses fail in growing numbers. Industrial production contracts sharply. By early 1932, official figures indicate that around 6 million Germans are unemployed, representing roughly 1 worker in 3. Exact totals vary depending upon the method of calculation, but the scale of hardship is unmistakable. Long queues form outside soup kitchens. Families lose homes and livelihoods. Entire communities confront uncertainty about the next meal rather than distant political theories. Traditional political parties struggle to respond with convincing solutions. Parliamentary coalitions fracture over taxation, welfare spending, and emergency economic measures. Increasingly, chancellors govern not through stable parliamentary majorities, but by relying upon presidential emergency decrees issued under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. Measures originally intended for exceptional circumstances become part of ordinary government. Ironically, the democratic system begins weakening itself in its attempt to survive. Amid this atmosphere of fear, frustration, and disillusionment, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party recognize an opportunity that earlier generations of extremists had failed to exploit. Rather than relying solely upon revolutionary violence, they seek to present themselves as a national movement capable of restoring order while operating through elections and constitutional procedures. It is a carefully calculated transformation. The strategy that will ultimately carry Hitler into the Chancellery is no longer based simply upon seizing power. It is based upon persuading millions of Germans, and crucially, many influential members of the political establishment, that handing him power appears to be the safer choice. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. For Adolf Hitler, this approach had not always seemed obvious. Less than a decade earlier, he had attempted a far more direct route to power, and it had ended in humiliation. On the evening of November 8, 1923, inside Munich's Bürgerbräukeller beer hall, Hitler and armed supporters burst into a political gathering led by Bavarian officials. Inspired in part by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome the previous year, he believed a dramatic uprising could ignite a national revolution. The attempt, later known as the Beer Hall Putsch, collapsed within hours. When the marchers confronted police the following day, gunfire erupted. 16 National Socialists and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler fled, but was soon arrested. Many political careers would have ended there. Instead, the failed coup became an unexpected lesson. During his trial in early 1924, Hitler transformed the courtroom into a national stage. Newspapers across Germany reported his speeches, allowing him to present himself not simply as a defeated conspirator, but as a passionate nationalist. The judges, sympathetic in some respects to his wartime service and patriotic rhetoric, imposed a sentence far lighter than many observers expected. He served only around 9 months in Landsberg prison. It was there that Hitler reassessed his entire strategy. According to his later writings and the recollections of associates, he concluded that another violent revolution would almost certainly fail. Germany's army, civil service, and conservative elites would resist any reckless seizure of power. If the National Socialist movement wished to rule Germany, it would first need legitimacy. It would have to appear as a lawful political force rather than a revolutionary militia. Violence would remain part of its methods, but it would be used selectively to intimidate opponents, dominate public spaces, and project strength, while the party simultaneously pursued electoral success. This dual strategy became one of the defining characteristics of the Nazi movement. On one hand stood the SA, led for much of this period by Ernst Röhm. By the early 1930s, its membership had grown dramatically, with estimates exceeding 2 million men, although exact numbers varied over time and many memberships were short-lived. Brown-shirted formations marched through city streets, guarded party meetings, and frequently clashed with communist groups such as the Red Front Fighters League. Political violence was by no means confined to one side. Germany's streets became contested spaces where rival ideologies fought not only with words, but with fists, clubs, and firearms. Contemporary police records reveal hundreds of deaths linked to political conflict during the final years of the Weimar Republic. On the other hand, stood an increasingly sophisticated political organization. Hitler appointed capable administrators to transform the party into a nationwide machine. One of the most important was Gregor Strasser, who helped expand the movement across northern Germany during the 1920s. Although Strasser would later fall out with Hitler, his organizational work proved significant in building a truly national party. Another crucial figure was Joseph Goebbels, appointed Gauleiter of Berlin before eventually becoming the party's chief propagandist. Goebbels possessed a remarkable understanding of modern mass communication. He recognized that politics was no longer won solely through speeches in parliament. It was increasingly shaped by newspapers, posters, photographs, radio broadcasts, and carefully staged public events. The National Socialist message itself was deliberately broad enough to attract different audiences. Farmers heard promises of agricultural revival. Industrial workers were told that unemployment would be defeated. Business leaders were assured that communist revolution would be prevented. Veterans were promised renewed national pride. Middle-class families struggling with economic uncertainty were offered the prospect of stability and order. Historians continue to debate how sincerely many of these promises were intended, yet there is little disagreement that the party became exceptionally skilled at tailoring its message without abandoning its central themes of nationalism, authoritarian leadership, and racial ideology. Technology also played an increasingly important role. Hitler traveled extensively by aeroplane during election campaigns, an innovation that allowed him to address multiple cities in a single day. The campaign, famously advertised under the slogan, "Hitler over Germany," presented him as a dynamic national leader capable of reaching every corner of the country. At a time when air travel remained unfamiliar to many ordinary citizens, the image carried considerable symbolic power. While rival politicians often relied on slower rail journeys and local meetings, Hitler appeared to descend almost dramatically from the skies before speaking to enormous crowds. Those rallies were meticulously choreographed. Every detail mattered. Flags hung in symmetrical rows, uniforms created visual unity, music stirred emotion before speeches even began. Searchlights illuminated night gatherings with almost theatrical precision. The intention was psychological as much as political. Individuals standing alone might harbor doubts, but within crowds of thousands, they experienced something different, a sense of belonging to a movement larger than themselves. Historians of propaganda frequently describe these spectacles as carefully engineered demonstrations of collective strength rather than spontaneous celebrations. Yet speeches and rallies alone could not deliver power. Germany still held elections, and votes remained essential. During the Reichstag election of September 1930, the National Socialist Party achieved a dramatic breakthrough, increasing its representation from just 12 seats to 107. 2 years later, in July 1932, it became the largest party in the Reichstag, with 230 seats, receiving more than 13 million votes, approximately 37% of the national total. Although this did not provide an outright majority, it transformed the political landscape. No stable government could easily ignore a movement supported by millions of voters. Even so, Hitler still lacked the constitutional authority to govern. President Hindenburg distrusted him personally, reportedly dismissing the idea of appointing the former corporal as chancellor. The Nazi vote also declined somewhat in the election of November 1932, falling to 196 seats. To many observers, the movement appeared to have reached its peak. Some believed its momentum was fading. Behind closed doors, however, a different struggle was unfolding. Influential conservatives, industrialists, and political advisors searched desperately for a government capable of ending parliamentary deadlock. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen, seeking his own return to influence after losing office, became one of the principal architects of a compromise. He argued that Hitler could be appointed chancellor within a cabinet dominated by conservative ministers. Papen famously believed that experienced elites would be able to restrain him, using his popularity while preventing radical change. It was an extraordinary miscalculation. The strategy that had taken shape since the failure of the beer hall putsch was about to reach its decisive moment. Hitler no longer needed to overthrow the German state. The state itself, weakened by years of economic crisis, political fragmentation, and elite rivalry, was preparing to invite him inside. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. On the morning of January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler arrived at the Reich Chancellery not as the victorious commander of an invading army, but as the lawful chancellor appointed under the provisions of the Weimar Constitution. To millions of Germans, it appeared to be another constitutional transfer of power. Few could yet see that the strategy which had carried him to this point was only entering its most dangerous phase. The appointment of Adolf Hitler as chancellor did not immediately create the dictatorship that would later define Germany and devastate Europe. The transformation happened step by step through a combination of political calculation, legal manipulation, intimidation, and the deliberate destruction of institutions that had been designed to protect democracy. On February 27, 1933, less than a month after Hitler entered office, the Reichstag building in Berlin was set ablaze. The fire destroyed much of the interior of the German parliament and created a crisis that the new government immediately exploited. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene and later convicted and executed. Historians continue to debate the full circumstances surrounding the fire, including whether van der Lubbe acted alone or whether others were involved. There is no surviving evidence that conclusively proves the exact chain of responsibility, but the political consequences are clear. The following day, President Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, officially known as the Decree for the Protection of People and State. It suspended key civil liberties guaranteed under the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and protections against arbitrary arrest. Police powers expanded dramatically. Political opponents, particularly communists, were arrested in large numbers. According to historians, thousands were detained during the weeks that followed, with many transferred to newly established concentration camps operated by the Nazi regime and its organizations. The atmosphere of fear became a central element of Hitler's strategy. The Nazis did not need to eliminate every opponent immediately. Instead, they created uncertainty. A journalist, trade unionist, political activist, or ordinary citizen could no longer be certain where the limits of acceptable criticism ended. The message was unmistakable. Resistance carried consequences. Yet Hitler still sought the appearance of legality. The decisive moment came on March 23, 1933, when the Reichstag met at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. The government introduced the Enabling Act, officially titled The Law to Remedy the Distress of the People and the Reich. It granted Hitler's cabinet the authority to pass laws without parliamentary approval, even when those laws contradicted the Constitution. It effectively transferred legislative power away from the elected Reichstag. The vote itself occurred under extraordinary circumstances. Many communist deputies had already been arrested or prevented from attending. SA men surrounded the building, creating an atmosphere of intimidation. Despite these pressures, the required two-thirds majority was achieved. The final vote was 444 in favor and 94 against. The Social Democratic Party was the only major political group to oppose the measure. The passing of the Enabling Act marked the collapse of parliamentary democracy in Germany. However, it is important to understand that this was not a single dramatic moment when freedom disappeared overnight. Instead, the Nazi dictatorship emerged through a series of calculated actions that gradually removed alternatives. Political parties were dissolved or forced to disband. Independent trade unions were destroyed. State governments were brought under central control. The judiciary, civil service, education system, and cultural institutions were increasingly reshaped according to Nazi ideology. By July 1933, Germany had become a one-party state. The Nazi Party was the only political organization legally permitted to exist. The transformation had taken place within months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor. The methods used to achieve this were not unique in the history of authoritarian movements, but the scale and efficiency of the Nazi approach were distinctive. Compared with earlier dictatorships, the Nazis combined modern communication techniques with traditional instruments of coercion. They understood the power of newspapers, radio, cinema, and mass gatherings, while simultaneously controlling police forces and building networks of surveillance. Other nations during the same period developed their own forms of authoritarian rule. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had come to power through the March on Rome in 1922, after which he gradually dismantled democratic institutions. His fascist movement relied heavily on organized violence, but Mussolini initially lacked the same level of electoral support that Hitler achieved before taking office. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin consolidated power through the Communist Party apparatus, state security organizations, and centralized control of the economy. The Nazi path differed because it combined electoral success with legal mechanisms to dismantle the very system that had allowed its rise. The comparison with other democratic societies of the era also reveals how unusual Germany's collapse became. Many countries experienced economic hardship after the Great Depression, and extremist movements gained support in several nations. Yet, Germany's political system contained particular weaknesses: a fragmented parliament, widespread distrust of democratic institutions, powerful anti-republican traditions among sections of the elite, and a constitution that allowed extensive emergency powers. The immediate effect of Hitler's strategy was the complete transformation of German politics, but its longer consequences reached far beyond government offices in Berlin. The Nazi state reorganized German society around militarization, racial persecution, and expansionist ambition. The same administrative efficiency and propaganda methods that had helped Hitler capture power were later used to prepare Germany for war and to implement policies of persecution and genocide. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 removed citizenship rights from Jewish Germans. The violent nationwide pogrom known as Kristallnacht in November 1938 marked a major escalation in anti-Semitic persecution. Eventually, Nazi Germany's actions would lead to the Second World War and the murder of 6 million European Jews during the Holocaust, alongside the deaths of millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. The physical remains of this history still exist. The former Nazi Party rally grounds at Nazi Party Rally Grounds Documentation Center preserve evidence of how architecture and propaganda were used to create political spectacle. Archives, photographs, and personal testimonies held by museums and historical institutions continue to document the experiences of those who lived through the period. These records serve as reminders that democratic systems can be weakened not only by open attacks, but also by gradual erosion from within. Returning to that winter evening in Berlin on January 30th, 1933, the images take on a different meaning. The marching figures, the torchlight, and the cheering crowds were not simply a celebration of a new government. They represented the culmination of a carefully developed political strategy. Hitler's rise was not achieved through a single secret weapon or one decisive act. It was built through a series of choices made over many years, exploiting economic suffering, mastering propaganda, creating a disciplined political machine, using intimidation against opponents, and persuading powerful figures that they could control a man who had already demonstrated his determination to seize power. The tragedy of Germany's collapse was that the mechanisms of democracy were used against democracy itself. Elections provided a path into government. Legal procedures provided the appearance of legitimacy. Political compromises opened the door. But once inside, the Nazi leadership removed the very freedoms that had allowed it to enter. The story of Hitler's rise is therefore not only a story about one man or one political movement, it is a warning about how fragile institutions can become when fear replaces reason, when division replaces cooperation, and when citizens lose confidence in the systems designed to protect them. The streets of Berlin in January 1933 were filled with music, flags, and marching feet. Many believed they were witnessing the rebirth of a nation. History would reveal something far darker, that the most dangerous transformations are sometimes not announced by the sound of battle, but by the quiet turning of legal documents, political agreements, and public opinion. A government had been handed power. Within years, that power would change the world forever.